Check Podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC political news. Thanks so much for being here on Check TV, Check Plus, YouTube, or where you get your podcasts. And happy Mother's Day as well for everyone who's watching us on Sunday on Check TV. There's a lot going on in BC politics. We're going to bring in the pod squad. Katie is away this week, but we have with us, as usual, Jillian Oliver, Jeff Ferrier, and on a very sad note, for the last time, Maclean K, who's moving on like one of those Jedi Masters transitioning into the Force and on into a world beyond politics and journalism. Very sad for us, Maclean, but glad to have you on one last time.
That is literally what I'm about to do, so I appreciate you.
It's not like you're dying. You're just dead to us. That's really the
exactly.
only thing. Yeah. Well, thank you all for being here. We're going to jump into our first segment here, which, because we record on Fridays, it was actually last weekend that Kevin Falcon won his by-election in Vancouver-Quilchena, giving him the MLA status that he needs to come into the legislature as the leader of the party, leader of the opposition. The numbers were kind of roughly the same as what we've seen in other by-elections in this very safe Liberal seat. The Liberals increased their share a little bit. The NDP dropped a tiny bit. The Greens lost a third of their vote. It's a by-election, so voter behavior is a little bit different. So we'll start with Jeff. Jeff, what do you make of the results, the numbers, and then kind of what it means to have Kevin Falcon in the legislature for the Liberals, the dynamic, and kind of for the government as well?
Well, first of all, let me say congratulations to new MLA Kevin Falcon. Lots of respect for people who step forward to serve the public in the legislature. Not an easy job, and won it fair and square. Congratulations to him. I've always found it quaint when political parties claim that winning elections in safe seats is a sign that they have the momentum of a runaway freight train. This election, for me, the key takeaways are, new brand spanking new leader, pulled below what Andrew Wilkinson and Colin Hanson pulled in the riding, only convinced 27% of eligible voters to actually show up on voting day. Conservatives who hadn't run before in that riding ran this time, picked up 7 or 8% of the vote. Not a big deal in Vancouver-Quilchena, but could be a big deal elsewhere if we see Mr. Falcon unable to bring together federal conservatives and federal liberals who have never disliked each other more in my lifetime, I think. What it means for Falcon is he's going to take his rightful place in the Legislative Assembly. So mean he's going to have a presence in Victoria. He'll be in question period. He'll be available to media. He's done that already since he's become leader, but he'll be there more regularly. It's a blessing and it can be a challenge. I think back to the federal election when it was Mulcair and Trudeau versus Harper, and Mulcair was the beast in question period, who dominated question period, who owned Ottawa, and Trudeau was out across Canada connecting with people and building relationships and spreading the message. And I think it's quite a balancing act that Mr. Falcon's going to have as he moves forward in his new role, to be in Victoria and play an important role and show up for work there, but also find ways to get out there and connect with voters.
Yeah, it's a good point. I remember a New Democrat strategist telling me at one point that one thing they had to get over is relying on the idea that the points they score in question period in the legislature in opposition meant anything to voters whatsoever, and that there's this tendency in opposition to really kind of glom onto that, like that's going to get you votes when it's out there doing other things that actually does that. So it's a balancing act for sure. Jillian, what did you make of the election results and kind of what's going on here?
I think it's a really tough one to glean anything about provincial politics from. This is one of the wealthiest ridings in the province. Houses are, upwards of $4 million on average. The NDP and the Greens lost a little bit of ground, but I think that just tells us that their vote is not super motivated, that those are voters that probably just stayed home during the by-election, the portions that they're missing. What I thought was interesting is that, you actually didn't see Falcon campaign that much. I think, the Liberals knew that the NDP were going to be using this to try to sort of, catch him saying something that wouldn't resonate with voters in other ridings. So he kind of kept his head down and didn't campaign a lot. That was a really strong contrast to the candidate launch for Surrey South this week, Eleanor Sturko, who came out with a really splashy, really nice video highlighting her record and sort of critiquing the NDP government in stronger, more focused terms than we saw Falcon did during the by-election. So I thought that was interesting and indicative of that by-election being a lot more interesting to watch.
Yeah, great point. I think everyone's going to throw way more resources and effort into Surrey South, and we've talked about it on the podcast in the past, how more important, because it's kind of more of a real riding that's up for grabs. It'll showcase a little bit more of the parties as they fight it out. Maclean, Surrey South, good get for the Liberals on this candidate, and how are we going to approach that riding, do you think?
I mean, they're all real ridings, but this will definitely be a closer race, I think. The question will be whether, traditionally, the riding has been a fairly safe BC Liberal seat. In 2017, they won with something like 12 percentage points. It was much closer in the last election, maybe 1,200 votes and a couple of percentage points. So the question is going to be whether or not that result in the last election reflects the BC Liberals kind of at their nadir in the riding, or if that is an indication of a trend that will continue. Obviously, the NDP hope it's the latter, and the BC Liberals the former. There's every indication that this will be a close run thing. The question in every by-election will be about get out the vote and turnout, all of the unsexy things that we tend to ignore in shows like this that actually determine close races. And so whichever party's machine is the most fine-tuned and actually gets people to show up on voting day, that'll almost certainly be the way this one goes. Both two major parties will be seeing this as a fairly life or death affair, because people like us will read way too much into it. But it will be an interesting month.
Yeah, I do think it's a great get as a candidate. Sergeant Sturko, who's on leave from the Surrey RCMP, but nonetheless a name in the community, a big ally and an outspoken ally of LGBTQ/TS plus people in policing, which has garnered her a profile as a very kind of modern, progressive candidate that the Liberals are hoping to attract in the next election. So I think that from that point of view, it'll be an interesting race. We don't know what the other candidates are yet, but we'll keep an eye on that riding, because we're going to have to, as you said, Maclean, overly dissect it and make way too much out of it, because that's what we do. Is from the outside, that's all we know how to do. But
if we know one thing, it's that by-elections tell us exactly what's going to happen in the next provincial election.
That's right. Voters in a by-election don't have any stakes, really. They're not going to bring the government down. They're freer to vote. They're conscious. There's less turnout. There's all sorts of variables that come into play that sort of change things. But yeah, no, point taken. Let's move on to our second topic, which is Bill 22, which sounds kind of, boring, because what is Bill 22? But you might remember it. It was a youth stabilization bill that the NDP proposed back in kind of 2019, sort of ish, 2020-ish. And the idea was, if a young person had suffered an overdose and they were in the hospital, they could be involuntarily detained for a period of time, up to a week, to be stabilized before being released, because some people in the grips of addiction aren't making the right decisions. They're not capable to make the right decisions. And so this bill was tended to try to address that. It turned into a political football, justification from the Premier in part for the election call. He talked about it repeatedly, said the Greens had forced his hand by refusing to support it, yet there was all sorts of critics refusing to support it at the time. And then this week, on Monday, the Premier announced, actually, we're not going forward with this bill, even though quite recently he said the government intended to bring it through. Jillian, there's a lot here. There's the issue itself, which is very important, the criticism, which is very valid from a number of different groups, and then the politics of all of this and the way it was kind of used. How do we reconcile all those things?
Yeah, I mean, I was very surprised to see this come out on Friday, which is, always an indication that the government doesn't want a lot of people talking about it. I think that, but, on reflection, I think it perhaps isn't as surprising, because even though the Premier voiced such strong personal support for the measure, there was so much opposition, like you said. And I think that with all the work that the government is undertaking, particularly on reconciliation, it would have been really hard for them to pass this and not face a lot of criticism for doing so. And I imagine, perhaps that they were facing some criticism inside their own caucus as well from some more, progressive members. Um, the chief coroner said that it could actually even lead to an increase in fatalities. It was, I think they did the right thing, and we're glad to see it. But yeah, I think it sort of tells a different story of that the premier was telling during the election, that this was the reason why he couldn't work with the Greens anymore, why they had to go to an election. And I think, the Greens come out looking really good. They stood up for, I talked to my colleagues that were working in the caucus office at the time. They faced tremendous pressure for over a year with the government trying to push them to support the bill. And I think they deserve a lot of credit for standing up and doing the right thing, because this is going to save a lot of lives.
I talked to Sonia Furstenau about this, and she recalled the meeting with the premier just days before he called the election, her kind of first meeting as leader of the Greens, trying to keep the CASA arrangement going, and Horgan bringing out a list of items, and Bill 22 being one of the ones he was just really upset about because he felt like he talked to parents and this is what should be done. And somehow the Greens got blamed for a list of critics that included the coroner, the children's representative, the Civil Liberties Association, every First Nations leadership group in the province, basically. But the Greens got pinned with it. Maclean, is this story just kind of nothing? Is it just faded out? Or will we look back on this when we're looking at the kind of history of how that snap election happened and point to this and sort of go, that was a bit of a misdirection by the premier?
We knew at the time that all the premier's cited reasons for going to a snap election were not the actual reasons. The actual reason was that they saw a vulnerability or an opportunity. The polls suggested to them that they were in a good position to win a majority, and lo, that is exactly what happened. The reasons they gave, which included this bill, but there were one or two others, amendments to a finance bill, something else, all evidence of the intransigence of the Greens, and just don't even worry about the BC Liberals. None of that was true. It was all about forcing a snap election, yes, in the middle of a pandemic, because they saw the opportunity and a clear path to a majority. And again, that's exactly what happened.
Now, although had they waited, they would have had a scheduled election in the middle of a pandemic too. So either way, when you look back on it, it was kind of... But you're right, absolutely. I think the polling numbers, when you look back on them now, the premier was in the 70s or the low 70s for popularity, which is incredible. Jeff, this bill, this issue, the politics of it, how do you view all of that?
I would just revise one thing that my colleagues here have said, and I think that the reason why the NDP called an election was that the level of trust that existed between John Horgan and Andrew Weaver wasn't there with Mr. Horgan and Ms. Furstenau, and that's what ended that relationship, and it was on a number of issues, and I think that's pretty well known in Victoria. On the issue of the change of position on Bill 22, I think it was Aldous Huxley said, the only people who are perfectly consistent are no longer alive. As for those of us who are still on this earthly plane, I think it's a good thing when people are willing to, at a certain point, confront the evidence, especially on matters they care passionately about, and faced with that evidence, they change their minds. I think when this happens, there's a tendency to be pretty reductionist and suggest that the motivation is the electoral laceration of one's political opponents. And I think this case is more complex. I've actually talked with Premier Horgan about this very issue. He believed mandatory treatment would help young people. He came to this belief because he met with moms and dads mourning the deaths of their children. He wanted to find a way because he wanted to stop this from happening again. And while some will seize on this and say gotcha, I find myself, and maybe it's not surprising to the folks at home given my political leanings, but I'm glad when political leaders, whether they're NDP or whatever, are willing to consider the facts, even on policies that they really care a lot about, and when the facts aren't on their side, go in a different and better direction.
Yeah, the only thing I guess I would add is the facts never really changed between that time and this time. The only thing, the thing that did change, and I spoke to some First Nation leaders about this, the discovery of the residential school unmarked graves certainly added an element to this, of children who'd been taken away again by the state in some cases for residential schools in the past. DRIPA becoming even more enshrined in government legislation, and that feeling that maybe that wasn't applied in the right way to this bill when it was developed prior to 2020. And so I do think the criticism stayed the same, but some things happened between the bill and now that made it untenable for government to do this, when the high overrepresentation of Indigenous kids that would be affected by this bill just made it not tenable for government to continue. But it is I find it a very fascinating piece of legislation to have gone through, become an election issue. And then I spoke to the Premier less than a year ago, and he was insistent that this thing was happening, and it was an absolute going to happen. And for him to climb down from that and then admit it, I think he sort of graciously admitted he was wrong in his climb down, made for a kind of interesting journey on an otherwise kind of boring sounding piece of legislation, Bill 22. So interesting bill to watch. Let's go on to our last topic here for the TV show, but stick around if you're subscribing on the audio podcast. We got some more that we are going to talk about here, but we're going to do a bit of a grab bag of ideas. Jillian, why don't we start with you? Is there anything, there's a lot going on out there. Is there anything that jumped out at you in the last week that you want to highlight?
Yeah, the government this week responded to a lawsuit that's being brought by the Sierra Club on the Climate Accountability Act. This was an act that the Greens made a condition of their support for Clean BC after the government approved LNG Canada. And it basically builds in a bunch of reporting requirements, more transparency in terms of how the government is doing on reducing emissions. And the Sierra Club is saying that the government isn't kind of, holding up to its end of the bargain on that, because it's not laying out sectoral plans for oil and gas, and it's not putting forth plans for interim targets, which are important because, if we only put our plan for 2030 out, that's beyond the next election cycle. It's really hard for voters and stakeholders to hold the government to account. I think it's going to be really interesting because it's the first time this kind of legislation has been tested in court in Canada. We have legislation at the federal level as well. And we also have the government looking at potentially approving phase 2 of LNG. So I think that it's going to be an interesting thing to see how it plays out in the courts and how it plays out on the issue of climate more broadly.
What do you think the implications could be if the Sierra Club wins this?
Well, what would happen, I guess, is that the government would have to sort of set its plans aside and come up with the plans for the interim targets. I mean, I think that that's a good thing to have more transparency and accountability. I think that it could also have adverse outcomes in terms of reducing the chances of other provinces passing this kinds of legislation when they see how rigorous the reporting requirements are. So we'll just have to see.
Bit of a double-edged sword there, but that's a great issue to highlight. Jeff, what jumped out at you this week?
Big thumbs up to David Eby and Rashna Singh bringing forward the Antiracism Data Act. This is something that policy nerds like me will pay attention to, and maybe folks at home not so much. But basically what the government has done this week is they have laid the foundation to collect, publish, and use disaggregated race-based data. And the focus here is on identifying and dismantling systemic racism. Look at, you can only change what you measure. When I worked in health, one of the first things I read and was told to read by the minister was the In Plain Sight report, which talked about systemic racism and poor outcomes for Indigenous peoples in our healthcare system. And if you don't see it, we don't see it because we don't live it. And bringing in this legislation, bringing in this reporting requirement, pulling together this data is going to help us, move from dismissing as, well, we don't see that, we don't understand that, to having some hard facts in front of us about how different communities in British Columbia are being affected by legislation and how we can do it better. And advice to advocates, lean into this. It's really good. It's a great way to measure positive impacts your ideas and initiatives have on key groups that government cares about and that we should all be paying a lot more attention to.
Yeah, for sure. It was a great press conference, too. There was lots of diverse speakers from different organizations, and they brought that point home that they're often saying that a certain group or certain people self-identifying as certain groups are underserved by government services in healthcare, education, social assistance. They encounter systemic racism, but they can't quantify it. And so this bill will help, like you said, kind of do that. I think for the public, they're going to see, I believe it's some type of sort of random household survey in November that will ask some of these questions, and then a data release next May. So we'll get, that's kind of the immediate impact for the public on this legislation. Maclean, what jumps out at you this week?
There's been growing awareness in BC's urban centers of a spike in crime, especially violent crime and random assaults. That was brought to a head last week when BC's urban mayors wrote to the Attorney General saying we have a serious problem with prolific offenders. In one case, they cited an example in Victoria of an individual with something like 250 convictions. He just keeps being returned to the streets. So the NDP government, wanting to move on this issue and not be seen to be ignoring it, commissioned what they would call creative action, and it amounts to a 4-month study, which is, we'll see, there could well be some good things come from it, but over the 4 months, it will be challenging for people who are witnessing or even victims of violent crimes to look at yet another government study as evidence of decisive and creative action, especially in a year which has municipal elections, and crime will be an issue. The lack of action, or even just perceived lack of action of the provincial government, will come up. And so it could be a rough ride for the provincial government for the next 4 months. Again, there might be some good solutions that come out of it, but for the next 4 months, they might take it on the chin a little bit.
The report, I think, lands in September, and the municipal elections are October. So that'll be an interesting kind of timing there. But it's a very complicated issue involving all sorts of different moving parts, and has been a very hot political issue, too, with the Liberals bringing it up in question period for several weeks now, accusing the government of being soft on crime. And then you get the feeling that this kind of response from government was in part pressured by that political dynamic as well. So,
sure it was,
all great.
And the mayors like it. The mayors like it. So
the mayors
good on
don't
the government
mind
for listening to the mayors.
They don't mind the 4-month wait because they say they've been dealing with prolific offenders for quite a while now. So yeah, no, the mayors were on board with that. Great topics. Thank you for mentioning them all. Thank you for being here, Maclean. Thank you for being on the panel for so long. Since the inception, you're one of the OG Pod Squad members. You're moving on to a different kind of world, but I think you'll still be active on social media perhaps, and people can still keep up with you, follow you on Twitter, and maybe see your insights into politics that way as well. But thank you so much for doing the show over the last year and a bit.
My pleasure, and cheers to you all.
Yeah, cheers to you. Thank you for watching as well in Political Capital. We'll be back with all the latest next week.